10 most creepiest unsolved mysteries in history. Humans seem to have a morbid curiosity about the monsters who perpetrate these serial murders. It's even the subject of our most popular list of all time. We like to think that these murderers will eventually be hunted down and caught, but of course, this is not always the case. Some serial murderers elude capture for years, even decades, and some are never caught. 1. Who killed Rachel Runyon? On a summer day nearly 30 years ago, a man used the promise of bubble gum and ice cream to entice 3-year-old Rachel Runyon away from a Sunset Park. Inside the girl's home, located less than 15 feet away, her mother was unaware of the abduction, as she prepared sloppy joes for her children's lunch on August 26, 1982. It is like some demon swooped out of the sky, and we have never seen her again, Elaine Runyon Simmons said this week of her daughter. The girl's almost unrecognizable body was discovered 24 days later, naked and hogtied, in a stream in Morgan County. Runyon Simmons has never stopped hoping the killer will be found, and police are still looking. Sunset Police Chief Ken Eborn said this week that detectives are currently checking out a former Utah resident, now living in Pennsylvania, who has been a longtime person of interest in the case. The girl's mother believes the Pennsylvania man may be her daughter's killer. "This same guy keeps surfacing," Runyon Simmons said. "You can't help but keep your eye on him." Eborn said Rachel's abductor talked with children at the park playground for at least 15 minutes before enticing Rachel away, according to police interviews with the girl's 5-year-old brother, Justin, and a 10-year-old child, who were also playing at the park. The children described the man who took Rachel as a black male, 25-35 years old, about 6 feet tall, with a medium build and a mustache. The children said the man drove away in a 4-door, dark blue car with wood grain stripes on the side. No adults were at the park to provide a description. Despite physical similarities between the Pennsylvania man and descriptions of the kidnapper, Eborn called the new lead not as promising as he once thought, and said the Pennsylvania man is not the only person they are watching. Out of 100 possible suspects, Eborn said, this man is in their top 20. "I think we would be doing a disservice to this case if we focused on him and him alone," Eborn said. The man, now 50 years old, came to the attention of police again, because of an Amber Alert issued last year in Pennsylvania, after he allegedly took his child following an argument with a girlfriend. The child was safely returned and the man was later charged with domestic violence-related crimes. He also has a violent criminal history in Utah, according to court records. Police, who have chosen not to release the man's name, say he lived in the Sunset area at the time of Rachel's abduction, and also has lived in New Mexico, Arkansas, and Pennsylvania. Police have organized 10 full 3-ring binders of case information, from their own city and outside agencies, including Ogden and Davis County, and even the FBI. Police also have about 10 banker boxes full of phoned-in leads. In 2007, Eborn used a grant from the Utah Attorney General's office to pay for DNA testing of items found near the girl's body. Eborn said this week that although he has tentative results of the DNA tests, they have not helped advance the investigation. A $58,000 reward has been posted for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of Rachel's killer. Runyon Simmons said it is hard to be patient, but all she can do is believe that one day someone will come forward. "I love her very much, I miss her," Runyon Simmons said of her daughter. "There isn't a day I haven't thought of her and honored her." Sounds like they have a suspect, but I've read some articles that state that nobody is coming forward, because the suspect has been making death threats towards those who may have information. There were also reports at one time of someone leaving black roses on Rachel's grave. "I know this happened in the time of satanic panic, and people were still associating murders with cult activity. It's a sad case that still has no ending." 2. Ted Loos. On February 23, 1974, police were called to the Los Angeles home of Dr. Ted Loos. The call was made by his wife, Wilda, who told officers that her husband was armed. When the police arrived, Wilda was outside the house with the housekeeper, and Edward J., a family friend. Ted didn't answer the door and there was no sign of him anywhere in the house. Finally, in the garage, officers found Ted's body in his car. The engine was running and a hose connected to the tailpipe had been fed, into the car's interior through a window. To authorities at the scene, the evidence of suicide was overwhelming, and there was no further investigation. No fingerprints were taken, no autopsy was performed, and no questions were asked. Zell is Ted's mother. They found him in his car, in the garage. They said it had to be suicide. It wasn't until a little later when things began to become so suspicious that I started to wonder about it. Of all people in the world, Ted was not one to take his life. To Zell, the implications of the dream were clear and disturbing. She believed the suicide had been staged, and that her son had been murdered. But Zell's suspicions alone were not enough to get the case reopened. She decided to track down her son's former housekeeper. To protect her identity, we'll call her Mary. Based on Mary's sworn testimony at a coroner's inquest, she said that on the date Ted died, she arrived at his home around 10 a.m. Ted told her that he was divorcing his wife, Wilda, and that she wouldn't be staying at the house anymore. But, according to Mary, around 2 p.m., Wilda showed up at the home. She parked her car and went right upstairs. A few minutes later, Mary heard screaming and yelling. Soon after, Ted dragged Wilda down the stairs. Wilda yelled to Mary that Ted had a gun, but Mary didn't see one. In her sworn testimony, Mary stated, "And I said, if you want me to continue to work with you, you'll have to talk to my husband. So he paid me for my work, and I got in my car and I drove down the street, and there was Mrs. Loaf. And then she asked me if she could go with me, and I said, well, yes, and then I drove home. She kept insisting that Dr. Loaf had a gun. So I called the police. They told me that they couldn't go over there if I hadn't seen a gun, and I hadn't seen it." After speaking with the police, Mary said that she tried to call Ted at least 20 times between 3 and 8 p.m. every time. The line was busy. At last, Mary got through, but no one answered. She decided to call the police again. Within the hour, police had found Ted's body. They suspected that Ted had killed himself. The discovery of a note in an upstairs bedroom bolstered their conclusion. However, to Mary, it was the first of several alarming discrepancies. During her testimony, she said, "I always thought that note on the shirt cardboard was kind of strange, because I had been ironing Dr. Loaf's shirts for a long time, and I always used a hanger. I never used a shirt cardboard." As she stared at Ted's body, Mary said in her testimony that she realized something else was wrong. "When I last saw him, he was wearing brown pants and kind of a mustard shirt. And now he had on gray pants and a dress shirt. And the whole time that I worked there after Dr. Loaf died, I never once saw those brown pants and that mustard color shirt that he was wearing the last time I saw him." The discrepancies became impossible to ignore. In the kitchen, Mary found several empty beer cans and 4 dirty glasses. Ted rarely drank. A week later, Mary found odd stains on a bedspread in the guest room. Wilda told Mary that it was vomit from the dogs who had been sick the night before. However, Mary remembers the dogs being in a kennel at that time. Later, when she washed the bedspreads, the areas where the supposed dog vomit had completely disintegrated. Ted's mother, Zell, said she was convinced that a crime had occurred. "After hearing the housekeeper's many stories, I knew there was foul play, and something terrible had happened to Ted, and that I had to find out what." In 1978, 4 years after her son's death, Zell finally won a legal battle to have Ted's body exhumed for an autopsy. The pathologist found clear evidence that Ted had suffered a violent vomiting spell moments before his death. According to forensic pathologist Dr. Irving Root, there should have been vomitus on his clothing, his face, and perhaps on the inside of the car. Why wasn't it there? This certainly strongly suggests to me that this vomiting occurred someplace other than in the car. And there were a number of other discrepancies that have never been explained, but that very strongly move away from the whole thought of suicide. This, until proven otherwise, is a homicide. Fueled by the autopsy results, Zell pieced together a theory explaining her son's death. She believes it was premeditated murder, and that Ted was assaulted soon after Wilda and the housekeeper left the house. She thinks that the people who killed Ted were close to Wilda, because they knew that the back door would be open. The autopsy also indicated Ted had been involved in a struggle. Zell said that she believes he was overpowered by at least 2 men, who forced poison down his throat. Ted was definitely fighting for his life. according to the doctors. Somebody took the phone off the hook after they made sure he was dead. Then they cleaned him up, and they put his gray dress shirt on him. Then they emptied out the garage to make room for the car. Then they had to open the gates to put his car into the garage, carry his dead body into the garage, close the door, and then go out and close the gates. Then they went back into the house again, I think, and put the receiver back on the hook. All afternoon, the housekeeper has been getting busy signals when she tried to call Ted. Zell believes that hanging up the phone was a prearranged signal from the killers to Wilder that their job was done. 8 years after Ted's death in March of 1982, the Los Angeles County coroner reopened the case. A witness told authorities that the so-called suicide note had indeed been written by Ted. But the witness also revealed that Ted wrote the message 2 years before his death after an argument with Wilder. The coroner's inquest ultimately ruled that Ted's death was a homicide. But on May 1, 1983, before police could investigate, Ted's wife, Wilder, died of a drug and alcohol overdose. Now, investigators are at a standstill on the case. Someone, they believe, may have gotten away with murder. 3. Leticia Hernandez. The discovery of Amber DuBois' skeletal remains along a remote road, near the Pala Indian Reservation this past weekend brought back painful memories of a similar discovery in the same brush-filled canyon 19 years ago today. Leticia Hernandez, 7, had been missing for 15 months, when a caretaker working on property off Pala Temecula Road found a human skull. Dental records from Leticia, an Oceanside second grader, were a match. The discovery that day, March 9, 1991, ended a search that had captured the nation's attention, as sightings of the black-haired girl, usually in the company of a blonde-haired couple in a maroon sedan, spread across the country. The case was featured on the TV shows America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries and was listed for a year as the nation's top child abduction case by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It even spawned a song, "Leticia We Love You," written by an Oceanside police detective. For those touched by Leticia's case, the discovery of remains identified as Amber, a 14-year-old Escondido High student missing for 13 months, was like the tearing away of scar tissue. It hurt. "That's really eerie," said Doug Sebastian, founder of Kinder Vision, a non-profit child safety organization that sprang up from the Leticia case. "That's pretty isolated out there. Unfortunately, we've got a North San Diego County dumping ground for missing kids. It's not just kids. The bodies of at least 4 women were found in that same area in the 1980s, at a time when authorities were investigating a series of about 45 killings. Many of the victims were prostitutes. Leticia's killer has never been caught. A registered sex offender who was 40 at the time, and lived a block away, was reportedly the subject of a federal grand jury investigation in the weeks after her remains were found. Nothing came of it. The only apparent connection between her case and the current investigation is the proximity of the remains. Leticia's on the east side of the road, Amber's on the west, roughly 2 miles south of the Riverside County line. Leticia lived about 25 miles away, in an apartment in the 1300 block of Bush Street, a block east of Interstate 5. On December 16, 1989, 2 days after her 7th birthday, she was playing in the front yard about 5 p.m. while her mother went to a nearby laundry room. When her mother returned 10 minutes later, the girl was gone. Police were called. The initial focus was on reports that a man in a late model black Cadillac had been seen in the neighborhood, offering children $50 to get into his car. That went nowhere. "We don't have a good feeling on this case," an Oceanside police officer said at the time. Then the sightings started, first at a Buckman Springs rest stop in East County, 7 hours after she vanished. 10 days later, she was reported on Interstate 10, just west of the New Mexico border. In all, police received more than a dozen confirmed sightings, reports where the witnesses were able to pick Leticia out of a photo lineup. The last one, in March 1990, was at a gas station in Greensboro, Florida because of the coast-to-coast sightings, and because the abduction happened so close to the Christmas holidays. Leticia's family refused to open presents while she was missing. The public was riveted by the case. Her classmates at Palmquist Elementary School rotated what desks they sat in, so that Leticia's was never empty. Baseball star Rollie Fingers headlined a fundraising benefit. Chris McDonough, an Oceanside police detective, composed the ballad, which was later made into a video. McDonough, who moved to a Dallas suburb, after retiring from the Oceanside force in 2003, remembers the case as particularly disturbing. "This little girl was standing in her front yard and she evaporates," he said. He would like to see the case reopened. "You can always hope for that," McDonough said. "Any murdered child you want to see investigated fully." Oceanside Police Sergeant Jeff Brandt said he knows of no plans to revisit the case. Police shelved it in 1992, after exhausting all available leads. Brandt said he believes cold case detectives last looked at it about 2 years ago. All the detectives originally involved are retired. According to news accounts at the time, police looked hard initially at the sex offender, a landscaper who was married and had 3 children. The string of sightings cooled their interest in him, until Letitia's skull was found. A federal grand jury then investigated him, but he was never arrested. Searchers combed the area for days. No other bones were found. Investigators said they collected 36 pieces of evidence, including some of Letitia's clothing. The medical examiner eventually concluded she had died within 3 months of her abduction. Letitia had 5 siblings when she disappeared. Attempts to reach them for comment yesterday were unsuccessful. Her mother died of cancer in February 1998. 4. Robert Hamrick. In the late 1960s, a group of young men began terrorizing the quiet and peaceful community of Rock Creek, Ohio. According to former police chief Andrew Cedar of neighboring town Jefferson Village, they were involved in fights. They were involved in threats. They had the entire village under their thumb. When they spoke, the village pretty much listened. The town counted on the sheriff's department for protection, but they seemed unable to stop the crime wave. So the citizens decided to start their own police department. In July 1969, Robert Hamrick was the 3rd man in less than 6 months to take charge of the new police force. The other 2 had both left after receiving threats from members of the Rock Creek gang. But his wife, Myrtle Hamrick, was confident her husband could clean up the town. He wanted it to be a nice friendly town, and he wanted, to get this gang off the streets so that people wouldn't have to be afraid of them. Almost immediately Hamrick and his family were harassed. Myrtle Hamrick knew there was not much her husband could do. They just did anything that they could to aggravate him. When they knew he was home, he would get fed up and take off after them. 5 months after he was sworn in, Chief Hamrick investigated an abandoned building on the edge of town. Inside, he found an expensive sports car that had been stolen. Police officer Gary Martin assisted in the investigation. "We came across it, fingerprinted it, and we bugged the building, because we didn't know who was there. We put a radio in our car and just drove around and listened until the guys came back. Bob was hiding in the office, and when they showed up, we jumped out and busted them." The suspects were believed to be members of the Rock Creek gang. They were arrested and released on bail. Soon after, the threatening calls began. One day, Myrtle Hamrick answered the phone. There was a man on the other end, and he said, "Tell your husband to leave things alone and get him out of town, or he's going to be hurt. And he's going to be hurt bad." 1 month later, on March 10, 1970, during a routine patrol, Chief Hamrick called in to report that he was in pursuit of a car heading west out of town. An hour and a half passed with no further radio contact. Finally, the dispatcher requested that deputies try to find the missing chief. 4 hours later, Hamrick's patrol car was located on an isolated road. It had hit a tree. Hamrick was semi-conscious and barely alive. Former Ashtabula County Deputy Chief Dennis Chapman was first on the scene. He had head and facial injuries. "I was surprised to find him moving when I got there. And then my next thing was to keep him from moving so that he wouldn't do further injury to himself." Blood covered the back seat of the car. Hamrick's service revolver and nightstick were missing, and the car's ignition and lights were switched to the off position. Ashtabula County Sheriff William R. Johnston suspected foul play. "I still don't believe to this day that all the injuries that Bob received were the result of that car accident." Robert Hamrick never regained consciousness, and 10 days later, he died. Despite all the evidence that pointed to murder, his death was officially ruled accidental, the result of a vehicular pursuit. Myrtle Hamrick believes otherwise. "I believe my husband's death was not a car accident. and that he was beaten to death and that it was covered up. 6 hours after the crash, the car that Hamrick had been chasing was found at a nearby gas station. It was splattered with mud and had a damaged tire. The owner of the car said that when she dropped the car off for repairs the previous day, it was in good condition. One of the station employees was known to be a member of the Rock Creek Gang. Sheriff William Johnston knew the suspect's history, knowing that he hung around the Rock Creek area, and that I had trouble with him in the past. I felt that he was directly involved. One local woman who wished to remain anonymous claimed that she overheard members of the gang bragging that they had murdered Chief Hamrick. They were saying, "We killed us a cop and we got away with it." And they proceeded to tell how they killed him and how they beat him in the head. They had it all planned. They set him up getting him down here on this dirt road, and they took his billy club and they started hitting him with it. They put him back into his car and then they left him there, left him to die. I knew in my heart they would never get caught. Chief Hamrick's daughter, Brenda Hamrick Lewis, still believes the people who killed her father can be caught. There is evidence and people just have ignored that evidence. And they've ignored the circumstances at the time, and what was going on in the village at the time. I just hope that we find out what actually happened, and if we find out who's responsible, that they pay for what they did. They took my father from me, and I think it's time that they got something taken from them. 5. Kathy Ford. Paul William Farrell, a rookie sheriff's deputy, was convicted of the murder of Kathy Ford, a 19-year-old waitress, from nearby Maryland. Her body has never been found, and no one had ever seen her with Farrell. Sometime after Ford's disappearance, her boyfriend, Darvin Moon, discovered her badly burned truck 75 yards from Ford's trailer home. Some believe that the truck was burned elsewhere, because there was no scorching on the vegetation surrounding the vehicle. Kathy worked as a waitress at her parents' restaurant. She received a phone call and told her parents she needed to go. She said that someone was going to help them, because supposedly there was a crackdown on underage drinking, and their business could be closed. He said he would help her and to meet her. She got changed into nice clothing, and against her mother's worries she went to meet this person. She never returned. Farrell would later say that the night she disappeared, he went bowling, and when he got there he was given several messages from Kathy, telling them he needed to call her right away. He called and she sounded strange, scared according to him. She told him he had to meet her at his trailer. He declined and told her to meet him in the parking lot of a nearby school. He says he waited for 20 minutes and she never showed, so he left. The next day Kathy's parents called the police. Her boyfriend was helping put posters up. Now one thing you need to know. Kathy was having an affair with Farrell. But she also had a boyfriend and Farrell had a girlfriend, so they were both having an affair. Farrell is told by Kathy's boyfriend that he thinks he saw smoke coming from Farrell's trailer, so Farrell goes out there and finds Kathy's car charred and burned. So he makes a mistake. He gets scared and doesn't say anything. Then he makes an even bigger mistake. He says he was so scared that he writes a note trying to forge Kathy's handwriting, and sends it to the parents. It says she is fine, she ran away, and here is $200 for help with the vehicle. Handwriting experts say it is not Kathy's writing. The car is found on the property and Farrell admits to writing the note, not telling anyone about the car, etc. FBI agents found traces of blood under a newly laid carpet, in Farrell's trailer as well as on the walls and ceiling. Laboratory tests showed the blood to be that of a woman, but DNA tests could not match the blood to Ford. Farrell said the trailer was 8 years old, had been occupied by others, and might be stained by blood from a variety of sources. At trial, the prosecution purportedly engaged in mathematical wizardry, which made the found blood look like that of Ford's. An FBI agent testified that while giving Farrell a hypothetical scenario about Kathy Ford's murder, he had observed signs of guilt in Farrell's body language. According to Farrell's appellate attorney, this is the first time, ever, in the history of American criminal jurisprudence, that this kind of evidence has been allowed to go to a jury. On the grounds that Farrell might have committed the alleged crime for sexual reasons, his trial included circumstantial evidence that he had telephoned bookstores and libraries throughout the country posing as a physician, and asking clerks who answered to read explicit passages from books on sex. A witness, Tamla Kitzmiller, testified to having received an obscene phone call from a man she took to be Farrell. She later recanted her testimony, claiming that the prosecution convinced her to testify by telling her that Farrell had been involved in a series of murders in Yellowstone Park. They told me that he was a sicko, and that he needed to be put away. After giving her testimony, Kitzmiller says she waited for prosecutors to produce proof of Farrell's involvement in the Yellowstone murders, as they had promised. This proof never arrived. Kim Nelson, a neighbor of Farrell, testified that on the day of Ford's disappearance she heard banging, a gunshot, and a woman's scream coming from Farrell's trailer. Later, however, she stated she didn't know nothing about Paul Farrell killing anybody, and that she had not heard anything out of the ordinary on the day in question. She later said that the prosecution told her that this man would come back and kill her children if she didn't lie and say she heard the shots on that day. She later recanted after he was in jail, and said that gunshots were very common in the area, so was yelling, and that she didn't hear anything on the specific day of the supposed murder. Private investigator and author Martin Yan helped expose the case by publishing a story about it in a magazine. He also got the case exposure on Montel Williams and Unsolved Mysteries. Farrell was released pending an evidentiary hearing, but he was reincarcerated for the crime in 1997. West Virginia Governor Underwood commuted Farrell's sentence in January 2001. He wrote that Farrell's convictions are not supported by the presence of the alleged victim's body, weapon, eyewitnesses, or physical evidence such as fingerprints, hair and fibers. The commutation made Farrell eligible for parole, which he was granted in May 2004. What you also need to know is that a few months after Kathy was supposedly killed, an elderly couple traveling through a town a few towns away stopped at a truck stop diner. There they saw a woman they could not believe how much she looked like Kathy. The woman was working as a waitress. When she saw them, she ran behind the counter and spoke to another waitress. The other woman went over and said, "You aren't from around here, where are you from?" The couple thought that was strange and told her. She rushed away to the waitress, who looked so much like Kathy, told her the town, at which point this waitress ran into the kitchen, and did not come out for as long as the couple was there. Anyway, hoping someone can find a photo of this girl. Even if we are just searching for a body, if there is some reconstruction done of a body found, it will help. If we are looking potentially for a live human being, we really need to know what she looked like when she disappeared at the age of 19 in February of 1988. 6. Suya Kim. New York City has always promised the hope of a new start to immigrants like Soo Young Kim and his wife, Suya. In 1981, they married in Seoul, South Korea, then moved to the United States. Soo Young and Suya worked in flea markets, until they were finally able to open 2 stores, one in Long Island and the other in Bushwick, a section of Brooklyn known for its ethnic diversity. As the business grew, so did the Kim family. Suya and Soo Young had 2 sons, and often the whole family could be found at the Brooklyn store. The Kims eventually moved to a spacious apartment in Queens. There, on the afternoon of June 29, 1991, just 5 days after Soo Young and Suya had celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, Suya left the boys with their grandmother while she went shopping. When Soo Young came home at 8 p.m., his wife had not returned from her shopping trip. He called all her friends, but no one knew where she was. Soo Young's concern mounted after he found Suya's car still parked in the garage, its engine stone cold. "My wife had never been out that late for the 10 years of our marriage. I was getting more and more worried. I could not stop thinking that something bad must have happened to her. I stayed up all night waiting for her, but she did not come home." A guard caught a man in the alley at 3:00 a.m. The next day, Soo Young Kim was summoned to the medical examiner's office to identify a body. "I could not and did not want to believe what was going on. As soon as I recognized my wife's body, I felt everything was over. The whole world seemed to crash down on me. I could not think of anything else except my children." Suya Kim had been stabbed 9 times. Her body was dumped in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, 7 miles from the Kims' apartment in Queens. Although she was nude, there was no evidence of rape. Suya appeared to be the victim of random violence. But unlike many random crimes, this one had a witness. Joe Jones was a private security guard hired to patrol an abandoned building in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Around 3:00 a.m., 10 hours after Suya had disappeared, Jones noticed a man behind a building. He hesitated a couple seconds. And he said, "What if I give you $20? So I said, "Yeah, okay." So at that time when I'm taking the $20, I see that he had blood on him. So I said, "How you get blood on you like that?" An ambulance arrived, but it was too late. The man's demeanor made Jones suspicious. He got a brief glimpse of the license plate before the car backed out. He gets in the car, drives away, but he stops at the corner. I think he thought I was going to go back and see what he put in the garbage. And I really got suspicious when he was looking at me and I was looking at him. So when I went back, I looked on the ground and I saw spots of blood going toward the garbage can. Joe Jones recruited a friend who happened by. Together, they cautiously searched the contents of the dumpster. Amidst layers of debris, they saw a woman's hand. It was the body of Sia. In an uncanny coincidence, the first vehicle to pass by was an ambulance, but it was too late. Sia had already been dead for hours. Thanks to Joe Jones, however, Detective Derek J. Parker had a description of the killer and his car. We ran all the Nissans that fit that description with that plate number in New York City, and we tried to match registered owners by using a partial plate. And we were able to come up with one match. The vehicle was registered to a Taiwanese exchange student at a Long Island college. She said she had not driven it since about 10 o'clock the night before. There was no blood in or on the car. And when Detective Parker checked the engine, he found it had not been driven for hours. There was a blue Nissan that fit the description that Mr. Jones told us, however it wasn't the car. Police then began to look at their star witness, Joe Jones, as a suspect. They requested that Jones take a lie detector test. He passed with flying colors and police were positive he had nothing to do with Suya's murder. For nearly 2 years, Soo Young Kim stayed in the United States, but the memories of his wife proved too painful to bear. In April of 1993, he shut down his business and returned with his 2 little boys to South Korea. I could not stand being in the store anymore, because everything there reminded me of my wife. Now there are no good memories for me here in America. Since it happened, I lost all my hopes and dreams. I have suffered so much. I'm still struggling hard to get over my wife's death for the sake of our children. I still truly love and miss her. Police have one particular theory which may yet help identify Suya's killer. The dumpster in Bedford's Stuyvesant was not easily visible from the street, so police believe the killer may be a delivery man or a cab driver, someone with detailed knowledge of the neighborhood. 7. Angie Houseman. 20 years ago Monday, 9-year-old Angie Houseman vanished, after getting off a school bus on a quiet residential street in Street Ann. Her body was found 9 days later tied to a tree in a remote hunting area in St. Charles County. When a deer hunter discovered her, she had been dead for only hours. That would haunt investigators. A matter of hours. So close. The already intensive investigation into Angie's murder went white hot, when the body of 10-year-old Cassidy Center was found dumped in a St. Louis alley the following month. Like Angie, Cassidy had been sexually assaulted. Was a serial killer snatching little girls off the street? But Cassidy's killer was arrested within weeks. Thomas Brooks was sentenced to death, and he later died in prison. The search for Angie's killer continued. It was a dual jurisdictional case. The abduction occurred in Street Ann, the murder in St. Charles County, but the investigation went well beyond those 2 areas. The major case squad was involved. So was the FBI. Early on, determination was mixed with much hope. It seemed inevitable that the case would be solved. There were enough officers to investigate all leads. One night I went out with 2 detectives, Bob Fan and Gary Quint, who were part of a team that was interviewing the 400 deer hunters, who had been issued permits to hunt in the wildlife area, where Angie's body had been found. Maybe somebody had seen something. No possibility would go unexplored. In addition to unlimited manpower, there was plenty of physical evidence with the body. Handcuffs made in Taiwan bound Angie's hands behind her back. Gray duct tape was wrapped around her head, covering her eyes and mouth. There was a partial fingerprint on the duct tape. The determination never wavered, but the early sense of optimism faded. A little more than 3 months into the investigation, Bob Lowry, then the Florissant police chief and the head of the major case squad, sounded a positive note. "We're on the 1-yard line," he said. I asked a detective about that. He shook his head. "If we're on the 1-yard line, it's our own 1-yard line," he said. Eventually, the major case squad dispersed, and the case became the bailiwick of the Street and Police Department, and the St. Charles County Sheriff's Department. For a long time now, the lead investigators have been Captain John Langford of the Street and Police Department, and Sergeant Ed Copeland of the St. Charles County Sheriff's Department. Both have long histories with the case. Copeland was the first officer to respond to the deer hunter's frantic call. Langford's former partner, the late John Chico Lee, was the original detective assigned to the case. Langford has been working on it since 1995. Several task forces have been assembled over the years to review all the reports. Was anything missed? Is it possible that somebody has already interviewed the killer? Facts have been pondered and repondered. Angie was kept alive for 9 days. That means the killer was living in the area. She had not been given food or water during her 9 days of captivity. Is there a significance to that? Mostly, though, it has been Langford and Copeland running down tips, re-interviewing witnesses. Several times, the detectives thought they were on the verge of success. A couple of times, I've been ready to call my wife and say, "It's over," Langford said. Like when Corey Fox confessed. He was, and is, in prison in Illinois for murder. At the time of Angie's abduction and murder, he lived near her in Street Dan. She might have known him. That could explain why nobody heard her scream. He would have been only 16, but that's not too young to commit murder. His confession did not check out. The latest hope revolves around DNA technology, which has become increasingly sophisticated. The detectives are planning to send some evidence to a lab in Texas that might produce something. In the meantime, leads keep coming in. Usually, 1 or 2 a month. Last week, one of Angie's relatives received a letter. She brought it to Langford. He checked it out. Nothing. I spoke with Copeland on Wednesday and asked about new leads. "Actually, I'm talking to a new guy tomorrow," he said. "I called Friday to see how it went. I wish I could say it was promising," he said. "Another dry well. But still they run down everything. The 20th anniversary is the sort of landmark that lends itself to publicity. Maybe the publicity will produce some new leads. Maybe the final one." 8. Sue Tarasquitz. 24-year-old Sue Tarasquitz was a trailblazer. She was a woman working in a man's world, on the tarmac of Boston's Logan Airport. Her mother, Marlene Tarasquitz, said Sue loved her job. Sometimes she'd come home and say, "I lifted 1,000,000 bags today and they were 200 pounds each." She'd make a joke out of it. But she never complained about the job. She loved it. Sue was the second woman to ever work for Northwest Airlines as a ground service employee. She worked her way up from cleaning the interiors of jets. After 3 years, she was promoted to ramp supervisor, the first woman to ever hold that position. On the morning of September 14, 1992, Sue's car was discovered at an auto body shop not far from the airport. In the trunk was Sue's body. She had been beaten and then stabbed multiple times. There was no sign of robbery or rape, so her family assumed that she was the victim of a random crime. For more than a year, Sue's family grieved. Then, at Christmas time 1993, Marlene Tarasquitz finally went into her daughter's room for the first time since the murder. What she found there was shocking. "I tried many times to go in Sue's room. You know, you've got to do this. It's a year. You know you should. Let me get something that was special to her and we'll just put it out." And I started going into her closet and I saw a briefcase there. Inside Sue's briefcase was a diary. In vivid detail, she described the sexual harassment that she had endured on the job. They were ugly incidents she had never mentioned to her family. The journal included examples of the graffiti, insulting, demeaning, and lurid, that had been etched in the men's rooms at the airport, and even in the cargo holds of jets. Sue's mother knew it had something to do with her murder. "What I read, the filth that somebody would write about my Susan." And I thought, is this why she was murdered? And we thought, this is it. We have solved Susan's murder. In page after page, Sue described acts of hostility. In one incident, she wrote of a co-worker named Bobby, who purposefully dropped her radio on the floor. Sue's boyfriend, who also worked at the airport, spoke to Bobby and demanded that he replace the radio. Then, later that day, Sue confronted Bobby herself. Bobby blew off the incident, and made a threat about beating up and killing her boyfriend. Sue filed many formal complaints with the management of Northwest Airlines and her union, but little was done to stop the harassment. In fact, according to Laura Brown, a reporter for the Boston Herald, it increased, often in the form of nasty graffiti. It wasn't apparently just one or two pieces of graffiti that made their way up and then were washed away. It was repeated cases of graffiti of varying kinds. In some cases, it amounted to death threats against other workers who were supporting Sue. Sue also talks in her diary about getting anonymous phone calls, at all hours of the night. She recorded some of the times the phone calls happened. She also had instances where her car was vandalized. Her boyfriend's car was vandalized. Friends who were supporting her had their cars vandalized. Despite the abuse, Sue's career hadn't slowed down. In February 1992, she was promoted to ramp supervisor and put in charge of the employees that she had once worked with on the tarmac. Initially, Sue was passed over for the promotion. A man in her union had illegally bid for the job, so Sue filed a grievance and won. But the victory made some of her co-workers uncomfortable. One of Sue's co-workers, Joseph Snow, said it had to do with the fact that Sue was female. A lot of them felt that they didn't want any females being their boss, that should be a man's job. It didn't stop her from coming to work. It didn't stop her from standing up to things that she thought was wrong. A few months after Sue's promotion, the graffiti became more sinister. She once found a coffin scrawled inside her personal locker. On September 12, 1992, during a graveyard shift, Sue volunteered to go pick up sandwiches for her crew. She never returned and no one reported her missing for a day and a half. Authorities now believe that Sue's death may have been connected to a federal investigation of Northwest Airlines that took place that summer. Some baggage handlers were operating a stolen credit card ring. When shipments of new cards were transported by Northwest jets, a group of workers was stealing them, using them, and then selling them. The scam netted over $7 million. Eventually, 10 Northwest employees were indicted and convicted. To Sue's mother Marlene, some of the names were very familiar. There were names of people that were in Sue's diary, that had sexually harassed her from day one. I believe that Susan was set up by her co-workers, that for whatever reason, they were afraid that Susan was going to squeal on something. Northwest Airlines declined Unsolved Mysteries' request to be interviewed for this story. But they have settled a sexual discrimination lawsuit brought against them by Sue's family. It was one of the largest discrimination settlements ever granted in the state of Massachusetts. Authorities still consider Sue's case open and active. Her family is offering a $250,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of their daughter's killer. 9. Leroy Dreeth. On Memorial Day, 1968, 18-year-old Leroy Dreeth had just left his girlfriend's house in Meade, Colorado, when his car slammed into a tree. He was killed instantly. The coroner's ruling was suicide. 25 years later, at his family's request, Leroy's body was exhumed for an autopsy. Leroy's sister, Vicki Merling, had always been convinced that her brother was murdered. "I took a vow that I would do this for my brother. And I don't feel like I can stop until it's done, because I would be letting him down. And I already feel like the authorities let him down. Obviously someone took his life, and that someone has to stand up and talk for him." Leroy was the oldest of 4 children. At the age of 17, he fell in love with 16-year-old Patty. A year later, they were engaged. On the day he died, Leroy went to a party at Patty's house. He left the party in the late afternoon. A block and a half away, his car smashed head-on into a tree. The first people on the scene were Leroy's brother and his father, Henry. "I tried to hug him, and I said, 'I'm gonna go get you some help.' So I ran to the truck and told Doug, I said, 'Run to the grocery store and call the ambulance.' When medics arrived, a bystander made a comment that Leroy had fought with his girlfriend, and that he had said he was going to kill himself. Delbert Mickelson was the ambulance driver. The coroner came to the hospital, went over what happened, and then I was the first one to relay the story to him that he had had a fight with his girlfriend and was going to kill himself. Based on that information, the coroner decided no autopsy was necessary. He called Leroy's death auto-suicide. Frida Bruce is Leroy's mother. I went to the district attorney in Greeley and I said, "I don't believe this was a suicide, I believe it was a murder, and I need for you to investigate it." And he was very rude. He said, "You're just a distraught parent. There's no reason for us to investigate this. You just go on home and get over it." I just cried. I never got over it. For 11-year-old Vicky, Leroy's death was the defining moment in her life. I remember that my mom was crying for a long time, and even though I was only 11, I knew there was something wrong. But I had to wait until I was an adult to attempt to solve the problem. I never did believe that Leroy committed suicide. In June of 1988, Vicky paid a surprise visit to the coroner's office. She expected to be stonewalled. Instead, they told her they thought that Leroy's death hadn't been fully investigated. According to Vicky, the coroner suggested that she hire a private investigator. I felt like it was a real strange thing for the authorities to bring it to my attention, that something's wrong here. Vicky became her own investigator. She knocked on doors, talked to neighbors, and looked for anyone who knew Leroy's girlfriend, Patty, or remembered the day he died. According to the townspeople, there was a party going on at Patty's house, and there had been a fight, but not between Patty and Leroy. There had been several other family members there that did not like Leroy, and that had been drinking all day. Vicky placed an ad in the local paper asking Patty to contact her. It worked. When they met, Patty denied that she ever told anyone that she and Leroy had fought and that he said he was going to take his life. But, according to Vicky, that's all Patty was willing to say. I felt like Patty knew answers, but was reluctant to talk. Vicky and her family decided to have Leroy's body exhumed, hoping an autopsy might provide some answers. Dr. Patrick Callan, a forensic pathologist and medical examiner, examined the body and made a shocking discovery. It was immediately apparent that this young man had sustained, actually, 2 incised wounds to the neck. And they were very characteristic of what I see all the time in persons who've received stab or slash wounds to the neck from a knife. Vicky was stunned. Leroy's neck showed 2 cuts, a stab wound, nearly 2 inches long, and a deep, 4-inch slash that had severed his windpipe. Based on this information, the cause of Leroy's death was changed, from auto-suicide to undetermined. But who had attacked Leroy and why? Vicky Merling thinks Patty knows the truth. In retrospect, everything leads back to Patty's house. Every time I think of a scenario of what happened, the same conclusion and the same thought is that it started at Patty's house with an argument. Leroy arrived for the barbecue at around 5 p.m. Patty's former sister-in-law, Carolyn Wirtz, was at the party. Leroy came over that day and a lot of Patty's family was there. And everyone had been drinking. I was married to Patty's brother. I was living in the house with the family, for about 8 months, before and after this happened. And Patty's family and Leroy had a slight argument, kind of a racial argument over girlfriends and boyfriends. After the argument, Patty walked Leroy to his car. Vicky thinks that just before he left, Leroy was attacked by one of Patty's family members. I believe that they continued arguing, and that a male person just quickly reached out and cut Leroy's throat. Patrick Allen thinks Leroy was fleeing for his life when he crashed. I feel that Leroy lost consciousness or lost control of the vehicle, because of the injuries. He would have been in pain and would have been extremely afraid, but the actual cause of death was injuries sustained from the automobile crash. Vicky claims that Patty contacted her again and offered to provide an account of the party. But when Vicky called to set up a meeting, she found that Patty's phone had been disconnected. Vicky is still hoping that Patty will come forward with the truth. 10. Philip Frazier. On June 14, 1988, 25-year-old Philip Frazier left his parents' house in Anchorage, Alaska to begin his journey to Olympia, Washington, cutting into Canada's Yukon Territory. His parents were physicians, and Philip was enrolled at Evergreen University to take pre-med courses. After a few days of car troubles, Philip crossed into the Canadian border on June 17. The next day, 600 miles south of the border checkpoint, Philip arrived at the 40-mile Flat Cafe, to look for a misplaced item in his car and take a few minutes to rest. Not long before Philip pulled in, a hitchhiker was dropped off at the cafe, also. He came into the restaurant that Gay and Tina Frocklaw ran. The hitchhiker immediately flagged their concern, and even though Gay, the mother, was finished with her shift, she refused to leave her daughter behind at the cafe for fear of her safety. After the hitchhiker finished his meal, he paid in Canadian money and walked towards the road. Shortly after, Fraser pulled out of the cafe and was summoned by the hitchhiker. Fraser seemed hesitant to let him in the car as his car was still moving, when the stranger opened the passenger door to let himself in. Philip relented, stopped, and allowed the man to get into the car. Tina told her mother after watching the two drive off that would be the biggest mistake that Fraser would ever make. 8 hours later and 200 miles south of the cafe, still in Canada, the hitchhiker flagged down a Good Samaritan, Eddie Olson, and explained to him that he was having car troubles and believed he ran out of gas. It was dark outside and Olson decided to tow the stranger's car and let him sleep at his home for the night. The next morning, Olson and his wife had breakfast ready, and sat down and ate with the stranger, explaining that the only problem with the car was a broken fan belt. Incredibly, the stranger tried to sell the car off to the Olsons in exchange for a plane ticket to Seattle, after explaining to them that he was a college student from Alaska heading to Seattle for medical school, something the man probably learned through conversation with Fraser. The Olsons showed interest in the car and offered to buy it, but claimed they needed to wait until Monday for the banks to clear the payment, which would have been too late for the stranger as he claimed he needed to be in Washington by then. After breakfast, the stranger offered the Olsons money for their hospitality, but oddly, took out 2 wallets secretively before handing them $20 in American money. The strange man soon left the Olsons and headed south. 12 hours later and 300 miles from the Olsons, the charred and incinerated remains of Fraser's car was found in a car wash in Prince George, British Columbia. Investigators found nothing inside the car. In fact, none of Philip Fraser's items have ever been recovered. At the time, Fraser was only considered a missing person but a potential homicide victim. 6 weeks later, Philip Fraser's body was found in a gravel turnaround area 70 miles from the Olsons' home. There were 3 composite drawings of the hitchhiker based on eyewitness accounts, yet strangely, the composites are similar but differ greatly. IMO. Even with the eyewitnesses, the man was never identified and the case is still unsolved. What are your thoughts on this case? How soon do you think Philip realized he was in trouble and it was too late? How can a man with several eyewitness accounts, and composites still evade capture to this day? How did no one happen to see this man when he set the car on fire and left with all of Philip's belongings? There are so many unanswered questions in this case.